Hello everyone, lovely to see so many people here. I would just like to introduce my old friend Susan Hawthorne. Susan was, the first time I met Susan was in 1985 when we did the Women 150 in Victoria, and I was in an anthology that she edited, so we've known each other for a very long time. Susan Hawthorne is a publisher and co-founder with Renata Klein of Spinifex Press, which turned 23 this week. She has played a leading role in independent publishing and e-book publishing in Australia and is the English language coordinator at the International Alliance of Independent Publishers based in Paris. She was a senior editor at Penguin Books from 1987 to 1991, has been a reviewer and organiser of festivals and chair of the 6th International Feminist Book Fair held in Melbourne in 1994. She has taught publishing studies and creative writing at universities and is currently adjunct professor in writing at James Cook University. She's also a writer herself and has authored 12 books of poetry, fiction and non-fiction, the latest of which is a verse novel, Lemon. Her poetry collection, Cow, was shortlisted for the Kenneth Slessor Poetry Prize in the 2012 New South Wales Premier Literature Awards and was also a finalist in the 2012 Audre Lorde Lesbian Poetry Prize in the USA. Earth's Breath was shortlisted for the 2010 Judith Wright Poetry Prize. Her work has appeared in annual Best Australian Poems and Anthologies, been broadcast on Poetica and other national radio programs, and published around the world in literary journals and anthologies. With no further ado, I hand over to Cynthia and Susan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for that introduction. So I'm here to talk about feminist publishing. So I'm going to give a bit of a history of feminist publishing so that you understand what I'm saying when I get to the later bits about fair speech and fair trade and fair speech. So the 1970s to the early mid-1990s was an incredibly exciting time in publishing. In 1976, I bought my first book about feminist publishing. It was called Women in Print, and it came out of the US. And even at that time, there were dozens of feminist publishers, and they were in every state across the USA. There were also publishers here like Sibylla and a few others that came and went at different times. The interesting thing for me is that when I first went to America in 1993 for the Book Expo, which is the big book fair they have, there was a long aisle of feminist, lesbian and gay publishing. By the late 1990s, that had completely disappeared. And I'll go a bit more about that, but in the, say, 1984 was also a really critical year because that was the year when feminist publishers in the UK decided there was enough going on around the world to have the first International Feminist Book Fair. Renata Klein, who's down here in the front row and co-founder of Spinifex Press, was involved in organising that. At that time, and then it went every 2 years, it moved to a new city. It went to Oslo in '86, Montreal, Barcelona, Amsterdam, and finally to Melbourne in 1994. And I gave the bid and I chaired the committee, and we had a great time organising it. But in the period leading up to the Feminist Book Fair, we also had the Australian Feminist Book Fortnight. That ran in 1989 and 1991. It took us 2 years to organise each of them. There were 200 events all around the country, and they were writers from overseas who happened to be in Australia at that time. There were writers going to country towns. I know that in Broome was one of the biggest events we had, where 200 people rocked up to an event. We also had catalogues. We printed 15,000 catalogues. They were distributed to bookshops, first by Penguin and then by Random House, now both the same company. And we had posters with the top 20 titles, and we had displays in bookshop windows. I mean, it was really incredible. And some of those things are now being done in the mainstream, like Books Alive is really the feminist book fair, but with lots of funding. It's basically the same way of doing things. The problem for feminist publishing events, organisations, publishers themselves, is that we didn't have any ongoing infrastructure. So with the feminist book fairs, for example, there was complete turnover of personnel every 2 years, which meant that every fair was really different from the previous one. But it meant also there was no ongoing structure, which is different from the International Alliance of Independent Publishers that I'm now the English language coordinator of, because it has ongoing funding. And if for one reason or another there isn't enough in 1 year, they say, oh well, we'll put it off this year and we'll do it next year, whereas we didn't have that sort of luxury. But all of that really came to an end in the mid-90s, and there are two reasons. 1993, Borders. Borders started setting up next door to, opposite, just around the corner from the very best independent bookshop. Now, most of the very best independent bookshops at that time, and I'm talking about the US, were feminist bookshops. And so just at the moment when computerisation of inventory was coming in, the feminist bookstores were faced with this competitor just along the street who had everything on computer, could afford to bring in writers, could serve coffee, had all the same books in the shop as well. So for a moment, for about a year, it was really good for feminist publishers because it doubled the market. But very soon, the feminist bookshops couldn't last. And then the feminist presses also couldn't last. And they couldn't last for another reason, and that was because what superstores do is they order large quantities of books. And so when they don't sell, which is pretty inevitable, they send them back. As a publisher, you think you've got all your books out there, you think, wow, we really sold well. And you say, well, we need to do a reprint. We've been out of stock for 3 months. We'd better order a reprint. Order a reprint, and just at that moment, Borders sends back all their unsold stock. So suddenly, the publisher ends up with excess stock, high warehouse fees, and the like. So that really did in feminist publishers and booksellers. The second thing was Amazon.com. There was one of the very best feminist bookshops in the US was in Sacramento, and it was called Amazon. It was a fantastic shop. We did an event there, I think, in the early 90s. And the women there were very organised. They were professional in every sense of the word. But when Amazon.com came along, they couldn't compete. And as well as that, Amazon.com had stolen their name. So they did sue Amazon.com and they got a payout, but it wasn't enough. And anyway, they no longer had the name. So that killed off that. Lots of feminist booksellers lost heart at that moment. And by the end of the 90s, the number of bookshops, feminist bookshops in the States had dwindled down to probably 20. Now it's probably less than 10. And the number of publishers, you can count them on one hand now, instead of about somewhere between 30 and 50, depending which year you counted. So that was really, really devastating. That was starting to happen when we did the Feminist Book Fair in Australia. And all of this was part of globalisation coming in. Globalisation works on the basis of homogenising everything. So under globalisation, the best thing you can do is make all the bookshops look the same, stock all the same books, have all the same authors doing the same rounds, etc. But, publishing doesn't work like that. Well, it depends. There are two kinds of publishing. There's publishing editorial-led, and the editorial-led publishing is, let's publish something that's different from anything you've ever read before. Whereas sales-led publishing is, let's publish the same book that was successful last year. So you get repetition. So it depends. And sales publishing is now winning. And this leads on to talking about free speech and free trade. We all know from our coffee consumption that free trade coffee is produced and sold in unfair ways. So many of us have chosen to drink fair trade coffee as a result. The same can be said in other areas, such as, say, just in farming in general. I mean, if Monsanto had their way, they would plaster the planet with all the same crops, all GM, all genetically modified if possible, so that farmers can't collect their seed and you lose diversity, you lose biodiversity. In publishing, what you lose is bibliodiversity, and you can see that happening. You can see it happening in the English language world. We're a bit more familiar with that, but also I've just been in Italy for 6 months, and there's a big publishing house called Mondadori. Mondadori is owned by a holding company owned by former PM Silvio Berlusconi. And guess who runs Mondadori? His daughter. So, and they have a publishing house plus a chain of bookstores. Rupert Murdoch is another example. I don't need to tell you any more about him. The other interesting thing is that one of the biggest backers of free speech is the porn industry, and they claim to be, pushing for women's free sexuality, but in fact, this defence is most often heard in the US, where free speech is guaranteed by the Constitution. But if you're a feminist and you criticise a pornographer, then what they say is that you are limiting the freedom of speech of the pornographers. And so they invented a mouthpiece for the industry, which is called the Free Speech Coalition, also came into existence in 1991. And it's there to protect the entertainment and pornography industries from the curtailment of their free speech. And of course, this is a big distortion of the idea of free speech. So Betty McClellan, who's a Spinifex author, wrote a book called Unspeakable, which unfortunately we weren't able to publish, although we have the e-book version. Otherwise, publications in Queensland published it. And she wrote about this concept, fair speech. So before I talk about fair speech, you have to think about how you achieve equality. If you're in a liberal jurisdiction, mostly what happens is you have equality of opportunity. That is, all the people line up at the door on the same level, and they all run across the room. Guess who wins? It's not, the marginalised, the undernourished, the poor, the undereducated. They are not likely to be first across the room. Of course, there's the odd exception, but they are exceptions. The vast majority getting to the other side of the room will be able-bodied white men. If you want to get equality of outcome, then what you have to do is you have to start people off at different points. So quotas do something in that way, but I think we have to come up with more original and useful methods, I think. But I also find it interesting that those who want to protect free speech instead of fair speech understand the necessity of a quality of outcome system when it comes to the horse races. Handicaps are about making sure that there's a fair race, because if they didn't do that, there wouldn't be a gambling industry, and then where would we be? So I think we need to talk about it in those sorts of terms and get those who think that free speech is the be-all and end-all to think along those lines as well. So And of course we've heard an awful lot about that this week because of the discussion about Andrew Bolt and the repeal of Section 18C, which prevents speech which vilifies on the basis of race, colour, ethnicity or ethnic background, which really is hate speech. And the thing is that George Brandis really didn't get it. If you did see Q&A, not this week but last week, it was clear that he did not understand the concept of fair speech. And I think it would have been great if on that program Betty McClellan had been there to talk about fair speech, because it was the wrong conversation going on. So just to summarise what fair speech does as opposed to free speech: it decentralises power. That is, it removes the power from those, you know, who the Murdochs of the world, the Monsantos, the Berlusconis, the Andrew Bolts. Fair speech also fosters justice and fair treatment. So it's about, you know, saying you can still criticise people. In fact, you can even say, I hate you. But you can't say, I hate you because you've got 3 heads. You know, so it's that sort of thing. Fair trade and fair speech focuses on the common good and engagement, so it's about social justice, and it also highlights the importance of life over profit. I could keep talking for a long time, and I did intend to speak about digital publishing, but I don't have time, except to say that we've been very involved in that. We're the 3rd publisher in Australia to have a complete catalogue up on our website in the 95, and as well as that to begin converting books to e-books in 2006, and most publishers in Australia didn't begin to do that until 2010. And so I just want to finish talking just for a moment about organic publishing. So if you think about organic farming, how it works when organic farms are small. You can't do organic farming on an industrialised basis. You can't do organic farming as agribusiness because the purposes are different. The methods of farming are different. Everything to do with transport and growing and the externalities of pesticides and all of those things are different. So you just can't put the two together. Now, what I'm for is organic publishing. Organic publishing is also less likely to be able to, small publishers are less likely to make massive print runs and therefore using huge amounts of paper. Also less likely to have those piles of books at the front of bookshops which then get returned, because returns are a part of the publishing industry, sadly. But we hardly get any returns, but I'm sure that Penguin and Random House and all the big ones still are getting a very large return. So that reduces the amount of diesel or fuel or whatever. We can actually, it is possible these days because of technological change to do smaller print runs. You don't have to print 10,000 at once. You can print 500 and make the numbers work these days, providing you're not thinking that profit is the be-all and end-all. So I think the other thing about organic publishing is that it caters to the local taste. So you're publishing to an audience that you understand. You're not just publishing to, the big mainstream out there, the Kardashians and the like. So that's what I would say. Let's do it for organic publishing.
Applause. Susan, thank you so much for that necessarily very quick skate through an extraordinary history and a very vital history, and a history I think that one can discover is very, very close to the centre of the story of the evolution of the book and our reading habits globally. But that's a history that seems to be radically unrepresented out there. I'd like to pick up on your notion of organic publishing and your emphasis just now on it as a matter of scale and conscious choice of scale. And then I want to link that in a paradoxical way with the matter of feminism, which has surely been one of the most important social and political movements of the 20th century. A feminist perspective, as you have said, can be applied to almost any area of knowledge and concerns what is important to at least half of the world. So how can the idea of organic publishing, as you've put it this evening, connect with that very big, vital picture for the activism that is feminism?
Well, my optimism comes because I know of feminist publishers in places like India, where there are a number of really amazing feminist publishers who are doing incredible work. Some of them are publishing in the English language, some do bilingual publishing, so publishing in an Indian language, whatever area they happen to be in, whether it's Tamil in South India or Hindi or Urdu or whatever. But those, I think, are very important. And I think that there are interesting things happening in out-of-the-way places. When we organised the Feminist Book Fair, we discovered that there were great things going on in Morocco, which we hadn't known about before. We have a friend in Bangladesh who's been running a feminist publishing house there for 20, 25 years, something like that, maybe more. And there's also a bookshop, and in order to go to the bookshop, you walk through a sari shop because, women are really meant to, not go to bookshops. But going to a sari shop, no problem. And if you go up to the top floor, you get to eat organic food as well. So Nariganta Prabhatna is a great example, I think, of a feminist publishing house that is doing all of the things. And we can't do organic farming as well, if only we could, but there's only 24 hours in a day. But anyway, so I think the thing is that feminist publishing happening in multiplicity of places, in different languages, in different countries, publishing material that is relevant to the local situation, but also, importantly, sharing that information among them. And that's what the feminist book fairs did. They allowed feminist publishers in different countries to talk to one another, to sell rights to one another, to do projects together. And it was an incredible thing, really. That's how I learned how to go to book fairs. I went to the Feminist Book Fair in Montreal the first time I was working at Penguin, and I got there and I said, "What do I do?" And the woman I was sitting opposite to, she said, "Tell me about the book that you want me to buy." Oh, okay. So that's what I did. And, after a while you get into the swing of it and you learn how to pitch a book to somebody, and when their face goes blank, it's time to stop.
I hope we have time to speak in a little more detail about the feminist book fairs. But I guess following on from the question of the organic feminist publishing and the examples that you've given, Simone Murray has pointed out that women-run print enterprises had a very strongly internationalist orientation from their early beginnings in the 1970s. So it might come as a surprise to some people that that internationalist outlook has actually been a characteristic of feminist publishing from its earliest times. Most people imagine that an internationalist outlook only emerges with the advent of globalising publishing conglomerates. But actually, in that way, one can see that feminist publishing was, in a way, at a forefront. And I wondered whether you would say that that kind of inclusive and internationalist outlook could represent some kind of a through line in the history of feminist publishing today.
Well, the thing about being a feminist publisher is you get to think things about 10 or 20 years ahead of the mainstream. And you hear an interview on the radio, you know, in 2014, and Renata and I look to one another and we say, didn't we publish a book on that 15 years ago? They didn't interview us then, and they're not interviewing us now, but here's, you know, this person here is getting all the kudos for this brand new idea. And I think also that that's true of the organisations as well. And in the International Alliance of Independent Publishers, there are several of us in the English language group who were part of those feminist book fairs. And we're having to educate the men in the group about what happened when we did it. And, you know, here are some good ideas, but please acknowledge that, you know, you got them from us. And so I think, yes, it is something. Feminist books do generally deal with issues earlier than the mainstream does. And I guess that's not surprising. It is that the margins are usually ahead of, the people on the margins are usually ahead of the people in the mainstream. You have to learn to swim faster on the outer bend of a river. You can't just idly float down the centre. You know, so that I think that it's kind of part and parcel of it.
And I guess needing to find sympathetic supporters, yes, wherever they might be
That's
located.
Right. Yes, yes.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned the men needing to be educated and the importance of acknowledging some of the trailblazing and pioneering ideas for the book trade and publishing generally that arose within the feminist publishing movement. There's a blog entry you wrote back in 2012 which we discussed in preparation for tonight, but it's a pretty fascinating and still very topical blog entry about the ongoing patterns of silence, indifference or sidelining of feminist presses and also of Spinifex in particular by the mainstream media, by writers' festivals and by journalists. And this is in spite of Spinifex's sustained history of publishing very topical, critical and creative writing by women that directly addresses issues of our time, such as gay marriage, ecology, violence against women, and the experiences of women from diverse cultural backgrounds. What I wanted to ask you tonight was, how could you explain this systemic pattern of silence, indifference or sidelining, and do you think fear is involved?
Yes, I think fear is involved. I called the article "To Whinge or Not to Whinge." Because I felt that, you know, if I were to complain, then somebody would complain that I was complaining and she's just one of those whinging feminists. So therefore, the alternative would be to not whinge, in other words, not write the blog at all. I wrote it and I sent it to The Age, and The Age got back to me and they said, we really like it. You'd have to cut it in half, and actually, on second thoughts, we're not going to publish it because we don't want you to cop all that flack. So they didn't publish it. It did get published in a couple of places, but none of them as mainstream as The Age. I could have dealt with the flack, really, you know. It's something I really wouldn't have worried too much about. You know, if somebody had yelled at me and said, oh, you're a whinger, okay, I've been called worse. So yes, I think that was a kind of censoring fear that was coming from The Age. She was fearful for me, who was not fearful. But it didn't matter that I said, I don't care. That's still what happened. And I think the other thing is that the definition of feminism is, I think, rather distorted in the mainstream. My basic definition of feminism is that, first of all, you have to recognise that women are oppressed. That's a pretty broad thing, and most of us look around, we go, yeah, you know, women miss out on this and that and unfair treatment of various kinds. The second thing is you have to do something about it. That is, you can't just be an armchair feminist. or a theoretical feminist. It just doesn't work. So you actually have to be prepared to do something. And the kind of feminism that gets talked about in the newspaper is usually a sort of liberal feminism. That is the equal opportunity one, where you get to run across the room and finish up in the same old pattern. Although every now and again, like when Julia Gillard was being treated badly last year, some of the liberal feminists almost sounded like radical feminists, which was an interesting thing. But most of them have gone back to being liberal feminists, I have to say. So yes, and I think there is particular fear about radical feminists, those bra-burning, man-hating, separatist, hairy-legged, all that kind of stuff. The Lavender Menace. I actually met somebody who was part of the Lavender Menace a couple of months ago. She wasn't scary at all. She was an artist and out to have a really good time. Fear is... Fear... Well, it's hard to say what makes up that fear. Is it they fear what we say?
Do they fear the precision of the observations made by women who know they have to be efficient and have absolute clarity of purpose when they do have the microphone?
Well, one of the things that I've noticed is that in writers' festivals around the country, there is almost always a session on feminism. No writers' festival has ever contacted Spinifex. Not one. Oh, no, sorry. There was one. When Gail Dines came to Australia, and they set her up on all sorts of people who they knew that would have a go at her, but actually she was better than them. So it is very rare that on a panel about feminism you'll find a Spinifex author. Very, very rare. Go along if it happens, please.
Meanwhile, Spinifex has just begun its 24th year of continuous involvement and activism through feminist publishing. You've described one skill that you bring to running Spinifex, being involved with Spinifex, as, quote, combining the commercial with the political. Mm-hmm. And when I read that, I thought, how in practice do you do that?
With great difficulty. The political usually wins. But what we've tried to do is we've tried to run Spinifex as a professional company. It is a company. Why should we not get the advantages that other people who run companies get just because we're feminists? And as well as that, we try to give good covers to our books, do good marketing, do really good editing. Sometimes our books are edited, by a number of sets of eyes. We rarely rush anything. So we think that what we do is very good, and when we go overseas, we find that people over there say that to us. We are very well known in the States because we've been sending books to the States since 1991. We started exporting there about 6 months after we started, and we also in the area of ebooks for about the last 3 to 5 years, somewhere between 20 and 30% of our sales in the US have been ebooks. I only use US figures because they're the only reliable ones at the moment. In Australia, it's all over the place, so you can't make any sort of general statements.
I was fascinated to learn that the market for feminist titles in the USA is bigger than the whole Australian market. Can you tell us a bit more about the market for feminist titles?
Yes, I can. The thing is that you only have to sell books to California and you've already got probably a bigger market. And I think one of the things that is working for us very well at the moment is social media, particularly Facebook. Through Facebook, we've been able to be in direct contact with lots of individuals and organisations on a daily, weekly basis, and getting to thousands through our Facebook. And we treat our Facebook as a kind of news service. You hear about our books every now and again, and we, you know, if there's something in the newspaper that connects with what we've published, then we tell you, because you then might want to come and read one of the books that we've published. But we don't push our books constantly on the Facebook site. We also think it's important to get out information about what's happening to women in different parts of the world. So within, going back to the US, it is harder now than it used to be because of the demise of many of the feminist bookstores, but through e-books, women in the States can easily buy copies of our books providing they've been converted, and that's the case for most books that we have rights on, and anything that's not a picture book, but we don't do too many of them. And most of our anthologies are also converted now. And quite a number of those are going into courses in the States, and courses in women's studies, which does still exist in the US, do help us as well. Women's studies pretty much died in Australia. When they called it gender studies, it was, you know, people just left. It stopped being so exciting.
I guess from the point of view of feminist publishing, there, in the earliest days, there was a very close connection between the coming to the fore of women's studies and the work of feminist publishers. Do you feel that within the university sector and the tertiary teaching sector and so on, that connection in a way has been lost or has been compromised? Some people have that view about the contemporary state of feminist publishing.
Well, when I did women's studies in the early 70s, basic texts were things like Shulamith Firestone's Dialectic of Sex, Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex, Kate Millett, Sexual Politics. Now basic texts are Foucault, Derrida and Lacan. You know, it just doesn't do it. And we don't publish them. You know, so I think that's one of the big changes, and that the postmodernisation of the universities has ripped the heart out of women's studies. Also, I think I could go on for hours about that, but I won't.
On a more positive note, I'm mindful that we do want to have Q&A with the audience, but there are still some questions I'm excited to be able to ask you, Susan. I wanted to come back to the matter of the 1994 6th International Feminist Book Fair, which was held here in Melbourne, as you mentioned, after a very successful bid put forth by yourself and Renata Klein. It took over the exhibition buildings for 5 days. There were 200 participating writers and over 23,000 attendees at the time. And all of the press that it was given, at least in Melbourne, mentioned that most of those attendees were fighting a brutal Melbourne winter wind. So the attendees were there against the odds. It just... In spite of those sort of implied caveats, it did get fantastic press, nationally and internationally. It was considered an important, if rare, event. They must have been truly exhilarating times.
There were a lot of midnight waking up panic attacks as well. It was incredibly exciting. And we had publishers coming from all sorts of places, but we didn't have as many American publishers as we'd hoped for, because they said things like, "Oh, it's a long flight," and we went, "Yeah, we know." You know, like just come once. That's all we're asking you to do. Anyway, but even so, we did get lots and lots of publishers here, and we were able to bring writers from Saudi Arabia, from Vanuatu. We had a really significant number of Indigenous writers. The theme of the fair was Indigenous, Asian and Pacific writing. So we made it so that they were the priority areas. But it wasn't just, it also included European writers and American and so forth. So it was this huge event. And I must say, in my mind, it's a bit of a blur, the actual event.
For all the right reasons.
Because I was running around from one thing to another and trying to be everywhere at once, which of course you can't be. But I had fun, we had a great time, and I think from what I know from other people who were less stressed than I was, lots of people said it was, just fantastic. And there were some sessions where you could barely get in the room. The session on radical feminism, I remember, I had one foot out the door and my head inside because I'd arrived late and so I didn't get a seat. But there was this incredible panel up the front. I can't even remember who it was now, but it was fantastic and it was so exciting and it was controversial and it was all the things you want at a writing event.
I guess I'm interested, following on from that, and the fact indeed that was the last ever International Feminist Book Fair. I'm interested in the idea of feminist publishers being by default, if not also by design, record keepers or archivists of women's voices. And I'm thinking here of a piece you wrote last year for AustralianWomenWriters.com about, quote, the forgotten women's writing festivals. 1994, for example, is not really that long ago.
Well, I wrote that piece because I get emails, through this Australian Writers Challenge, Australian Women Writers Challenge, which a woman called Elizabeth Luhede from Sydney runs. And they were organising a Women's Writers Festival in Sydney, and somebody on the organising committee said, has there ever been one before? So I went, yes! And I started with the first one that I went to in Sydney in 1982. That was a great weekend of women writing. And then there was the Women 150 one that Judy talked about before, which was called The Language of Difference. And it ran for 9 days. I mean, only somebody who'd never organised a Writers' Festival would do something like that. But we had 3 days of panels, 3 days of workshops and launches, and then another 3 days of panels. By the Thursday, I had second wind, and off I went. It was incredible. But at that, we also had sessions on migrant women's writing, Aboriginal women's writing, writing about class and sexuality and experimental writing, all the things that writers' festivals these days think, we'll have a session on Aboriginal women's writing. I mean, actually, they don't even do that. So, these things have happened. We need people on all the festival organising committees. So get out there and join committees and turn things around. I think that's what we need, and we need as many feminist publishers as we can get. As I said before, there's Otherwise in Queensland, in Melbourne here. There's Dyke Books. There's also Longbreast Press, but we're small. We can't do everything, and that is trouble for us. We get far too many manuscripts that we can't publish, because we can't do it all. We see things and we think, yes, we'd like to do this, but we can't. Or it's a book that doesn't work for some reason, and it's very difficult, and it's very different from working in a place like Penguin, which I did for 4 years, where if you bounced enough, or if you had enough enthusiasm for something and you could push a marketing plan and so forth, then mostly you could get it through. Although that changed a bit in the early 90s. But even so, it was possible to do things that are more difficult for smaller presses, although the smaller presses generally do the risky publishing. And actually, just on that, in the e-book area, that's happening too, because last year, I don't know if you know of the company called Bookish, but it was a small digital publishing distributor that they worked with readings and other independent booksellers, and worked with the small publishers network here, and it enabled us all to get our books out through bookshops and so forth. But they got sold, and I'm sure that was great for the company, but they sold to an American organisation called Overdrive, which is a big library ordering thing. And what they say about it is, this company comes at it with such a fresh approach to cloud reading and the like. And that's the thing. The big publishers depend on the freshness and the riskiness that the small publishers do, in the same way that a company like Monsanto depends on the wild seed, depends on the biodiversity. So that's why, I'm saying that biodiversity and bibliodiversity kind of go hand in hand.
In fact, I think I've read that you mentioned that you couldn't have ecology as a discipline or an area of interest or research without having had feminism first.
Yes. Well, actually, one of the earliest ecologists is Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson really started ecology.
Just mindful of the time, sadly, and really would love to open the floor up to 10 minutes or so of questions. If people have questions, we've got 2 roving mics here. Any questions for Susan Hawthorne this evening? We don't seem to have done very well with our stooges.
Oh. Susan, I wonder if you could give a glimpse of your view of the future.
Well, I'm a short-term pessimist and a long-term optimist. And I think probably Mary Wollstonecraft had the same outlook. And we're still trying to put in place some of the things that Mary Wollstonecraft was calling for back in 1793. You also see, the ideas that were put forward, at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. A lot of those things, some have come into being, many have not. And I think the difficulty for, let's say, in publishing is that we face the prospect of a recolonisation through, for example, if I sign a contract with one of the very big retailers of e-books, they come from the USA, they write their contracts as if the person signing on the other end is a multinational. They expect you to have an American bank account. They expect you to have an American tax number, a whole stack of things that just are there. You go, help! What am I going to do? I mean, eventually you figure out how you're going to do this. And you basically, if you want to have an agreement, that's what you have to have. And so the thing is that there is a process, I think, of recolonisation going on through the e-book, the development of e-books. And although we decided to do e-books in 2006 because we thought if people are going to start digitising books, they're not going to put ours at the front of the pile, so we'd better get in there and do it soon. So we went into doing e-books very early in order to make sure that our books would be around for the future. Now, whether they will be readable, that is another matter. And somebody says, well, the best way to make something last is to print books on acid-free paper, and I agree with that, but acid-free paper is very expensive. We are printing books as well, so we will have our books available in both print and e-book form, and we hope that somehow or other they'll survive. But I think for small publishers, I think self-publishing is an incredible growth thing. And as a self-publisher, you can do things that a publisher, even as small as Spinifex, and we've done 250 books roughly, that we can't do because we've got overheads that we have to cover. And as a self-publisher, well, if you do it in your living room, you don't have overheads. If you do it yourself and you're not paying anybody, you don't have any overheads. I mean, you've got earn enough to eat and things like that. But there are things that you can do as a self-publisher that you can't as a small publisher. So I think that that's potentially a very good area, and you can see that happening in poetry. I mean, there's a boom in poetry publishing, and I think that that's because of the digital. The risky stuff goes there.
Just thinking that self-publishing gives you the most control over your own work.
It depends. If you sign one of those contracts with one of the really big guys, the gorillas as we call them, which is a bit of an insult to the gorillas, then you can actually finish up not in a good position. So I would suggest that if you are self-publishing and you're going through those things, get somebody with legal training to have a look at the contract, just to check that you're not signing away all your copyright. Very important.
Got another question down here.
I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your writing life and sort of the journey and any obstacles that you know, how that's...
How long do you have?
I know, it's a broad question, I know.
Oh, well, I mean, I think I came fairly late to writing in some ways, but I decided to give myself 3 months when I thought, right, I'm going to be a writer. So I gave myself 3 months and said, you've got to get something published. Fortunately, I did. And so I kept writing. And then, because I'd been unemployed for a really long time, I got the job organising the Women 150 event. So I'd been unemployed for 15 months, I think it was, so I needed to be rescued, which was great, actually. It was a great job to finish up in. And then I met publishers who I discovered were not two-headed people. And I also began, during that 15 months of unemployment, I was writing a lot. That was in the early 80s. So I came to it fairly slowly. I then got into publishing, and it's difficult to write something long when you're working in publishing. So I kind of shifted away from novels to poetry. And then in the middle I also did a PhD, so I got to write a big non-fiction work. But I think that for me, what I tend to do now is I try to take a particular amount of time off, and I've been lucky in the last 5-6 years to get first 4 months to go to India and spend some time writing, and then last year I went to Rome, which was fabulous. I'm going to go to this exhibition down here at the State, or at the State Library, so those times have been really good because I've actually been able to really concentrate, and I don't know, I spend a lot of time thinking about writing, and then I tend to binge for a time. Then I put things in drawers, they percolate, they do whatever it is they need to do in that drawer, and then I come back and I think, well, should I continue or not? And you know, it's all hit and miss, I think. I am lucky to have a very special relationship with myself as the publisher at Spinifex, so I have to admit that. But I also make sure that I get a good editor of my work. I insist that my work be edited as hard as possible, because it's important. I mean, editing is, well, I think it's something that is really interesting because there is somebody there who is taking your writing seriously, and you can have a serious conversation with them. And so even when they tell you, you know, you've got to lose that bit, and you go, oh, gee, that was my favourite bit, you do actually have to be prepared to listen. Even if you get angry first, you know, and you go off and you smoulder, after about a week you go, oh, maybe she's right. So, yeah, you know, I think those things are terribly important.
I think we have time for just one more question down the back there. Thank you, Susan.
Hi. Regarding fear and radical feminism, Alex Dobkins said that men are afraid of women without men. I'm Barbara Clark from Feminist Press. We're lesbian self-publishers. We've just published our 3rd book, and I am absolutely delighted to say that we can make quite a good profit by not selling our books through any shop, just selling them ourselves and via word of mouth. And I hope that our books and your books, Susan, will be preserved in the women's library that I'm determined that there will be in Melbourne, and anybody who wants to join me in this dream is welcome.
Thank you, Barbara. And I do think it's important that there's multiple feminist publishers around, and that's one of the things that made possible the kind of joint activities of the 1980s and 1990s, and still too. You know, it's not that we've stopped doing things, we're doing it slightly differently. Most of us who are doing joint activities now either met back then or we met through somebody that we knew back then. So it is one of those things, and you know, book fairs are a way of spreading the word and meeting people who are doing similar things to say what we're doing, or who want to translate our books. That's always exciting.
I'm so sorry that we have to wind up, because it certainly feels like we've only just begun discussing this. It's a milieu that should be much closer, more often centre stage when any discussion of publishing occurs.
Can I just say a special thank you to Renata Klein, who's down here in the front row, for for being on this journey with me, and for everybody who works at Spinifex now, and for anybody who's ever worked at Spinifex. We couldn't have done it without you.
I just wanted to observe that this Saturday just past was the official 23rd birthday of Spinifex Press. As mentioned earlier this evening, it was founded in 1991, and I discovered in researching for this evening that the International PEN Women Writers Committee, which had kind of had its earliest history beginning in the mid-80s, actually became a formal standing committee of International PEN also in 1991. So evidently an auspicious year for anything to do with women and writing in our globalised world. Would you please join me in thanking Susan Hawthorne for speaking this evening, and also I think let's salute the perseverance, sustained vision and creativity behind Spinifex Press.